As the Third Reich hunted the last Jew still hiding in Berlin, one woman seemed to move freely. She slipped through cafes, train stations, and apartment buildings, scanning faces. Sometimes, she didn't even need to point. A quiet word to the Gestapo was enough. At first glance, she looked like the Aryan ideal. Blonde hair, blue eyes. The perfect informant, trained by the Gestapo themselves. There was just one problem. She was Jewish. Once, Stella Goldschlag had worn a yellow star. Now, she carried Gestapo papers. Once, she had been hunted. Now, she hunted her own people. The Gestapo called her the blonde poison. Her victims called her a monster. But the truth was a lot more complicated. The Germans promised they would spare her parents if she helped them hunt Jews. But they did not keep that promise. And Stella was now caught between worlds. So, how did a Jewish woman hunted by the Third Reich become the Gestapo's most valuable weapon? At first glance, Stella Goldschlag was a typical German girl. Born in Berlin in 1922 to Jewish musicians, she grew up immersed in German culture. If anything ever reminded Stella that she was different from her non-Jewish classmates, it was subtle, a teacher's occasional jab, a joke at her expense. What did stand out about Stella was her beauty. With pale skin, blue eyes, and blonde hair, she looked like the Nazi ideal. Little did she know, the Berlin she knew and loved was about to crumble. First, her father was forced to quit his job due to his Jewish ancestry. Then came the notice that she could no longer attend school with her non-Jewish friends. And then came the night of the broken glass. On the afternoon of November 9th, 1938, Stella rushed home to learn the Jewish men were being deported, and her father had gone into hiding. That night, she and her mother held each other, petrified, as German soldiers stormed the streets, smashing windows, burning synagogues, and hauling thousands of Jews onto cattle cars. Stella and her family needed to get out, fast. But all around the world, countries closed their borders. No one wanted to take in Jewish refugees. Less than a year later, the Nazis marched on Poland, and any chance of escape evaporated. Stella and her mother were drafted to work as forced laborers in an ammunition factory. There, she married another Jewish worker. But in 1943, the German police raided the factory, deporting Stella's husband along with thousands of others. With their blonde hair and blue eyes, Stella and her mother managed to escape and blend in. But they were on borrowed time. They knew nowhere was safe, so they joined Stella's father underground. They called themselves U-boats, after the German submarines that dive deep below the water to avoid detection. Nearly 6,500 Jews lived like this, hiding in plain sight. The rules were simple. Tear up any evidence of your Jewish identity. Avoid neighborhoods where people might recognize you. Emerge only in disguise. The U-boats lived in lofts and churches and basements, relying on good-hearted German families to shelter them. But the real trick was to get the right papers, ones that confirmed that you were not a Jew. Luckily, Stella knew just the guy. Gunter Rogoff had once been a classmate. Now, he was wanted by the Germans for forging passports for fellow Jews in hiding. And he was always happy to help out an old friend. With her new forged papers and her Aryan looks, Stella didn't have to spend her life rotting in dark basements. She could move through Berlin in broad daylight. On a summer evening in 1943, Stella's life as she knew it came to an end. She was sitting in a bar waiting to meet her friend, the infamous forger Rolf Isaacson, when Gestapo officers closed in without warning. They swarmed her, snapped handcuffs around her wrists. Even though she had the right papers, even though she had the right look. So how did they know she was Jewish? What had given her away? And then, Stella saw her. Behind the officer stood a Jewish woman Stella recognized, an acquaintance who had already been caught. The Germans had turned her into a snatcher, one of the hunted who now helped hunt down other Jews in hiding. As the woman watched, the officers emptied Stella's pockets, found the forged papers. They saw the handiwork of the master forger Rogoff, the very man they had been looking for. What followed was not just an interrogation. It was an attempt to break Stella completely. The Gestapo hauled Stella to their headquarters and locked her in a flooded basement cell, alone. "Tell us where Rogoff is," they demanded. But Stella didn't know. They kicked her, choked her, beat her until she bled. She couldn't eat for days. She could barely even open her mouth. She pleaded with her captors for mercy, but they didn't believe her. They continued to torment her until she lay unconscious on the ground. Finally, they gave up and threw her into prison. Miraculously, Stella managed to escape, making a run for it when she was brought to the prison hospital for a toothache. But less than 12 hours later, the Gestapo dragged her back. she had returned to her parents' hiding place, which meant that this time, it wasn't just Stella's life on the line, it was her parents too. The Germans threw Stella's parents into a detention camp to await deportation. They took Stella to be interrogated again. Again, the officers beat her, cocked a gun at her head, threatened to violate her. But she still didn't have the information about Rogov that they wanted, so they threw her into prison once again. An air raid from the British provided Stella yet another chance to escape. Amid the blasts, she managed to flee. But she wasn't going back into hiding. She was going to save her parents. She went to the camp where her parents were detained, begging the Gestapo to let her see them. At that moment, all she wanted was her mom and dad, even if that meant that she would be deported right along with them to face, well, no one was quite sure what was happening in those camps out east, but they knew it was very, very bad. But the officers noted her good looks, her intelligence, her perfect Aryan face. Here was the perfect tool, the perfect weapon against other Jews, if they could find the right incentive. They didn't have to look far. There were two incentives right there in the detention camp, Stella's mother and father. So the Gestapo proposed a deal. Help us find other Jews in hiding, and we won't deport your parents. Broken and bleeding, Stella thought about her mother, her father, wasting away, awaiting an unspeakable fate. The officers urged her. This was the only way to keep her parents safe. It was a cruel and impossible choice. Lead the officers to Jewish friends who would surely be tortured and murdered, or sacrifice her own parents, the only family she had left after her husband's deportation. There were no good choices. No matter what she decided, someone would end up in hell. She just didn't want it to be her parents. This was the only way she could save her family. There was no other way out. So she agreed to hunt other Jews, to become a snatcher, just like the woman who had betrayed her. Her first target was Rogov the forger, the same man who had forged her ID. With knots in her stomach, she wrote him a note asking to meet. But when he showed up, it wasn't Stella he found. It was the Gestapo. And Stella didn't need to imagine what they did to her old friend. It was her first taste of her new life as a Greiferin, a Jewish hunter of Jews. It was horrible. It was also the only way she could buy her parents' lives. The SS knew exactly what they were doing. It was a sadistic tactic. That was the point. Make Jews turn on each other, turn the victims into perpetrators, dangle their families' lives in front of them, give them an impossible choice. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. Officially, they were called the Jewish Search Service, led by SS officer Walter Dobberke. There were only 20 or so Greifers in Berlin, but they were surprisingly effective. They knew the House of Cards could collapse at any second, that the Reich could renege on its promises, that their lives and their loved ones' lives were on the line. They knew the Gestapo was watching them closely, and they knew that the SS meant every single word of their constant threats. If they didn't do what they were told, they and their loved ones would be beaten, imprisoned, deported, maybe worse. So they did what they were told. They hoped it would be enough to get their families through. So where other Jews wore the yellow star, Greifers walked around with Gestapo papers and guns. Where other Jews starved, Greifers received extra rations. Other Jews were crowded into camps, marked for deportation, but Greifers were erased from deportation lists so they could continue to scour Berlin for rogue Jews. With the Gestapo's training and the Gestapo's intel, the Greifers lured Jews from their hiding places, right into the Germans' arms. And Stella became one of the very best. Her time in Jewish school had made her familiar with many of the city's Jews. Her impeccable memory allowed her to keep a catalog of names in her mind, and her good looks were like bait, luring people in. Dobberke assigned Stella a district of the city to serve as her hunting grounds. She would work in tandem with Rolf Isaacson, the former forger she had been waiting to meet when she got arrested. Like her, Rolf had been betrayed. Like her, Rolf had been recruited for his skills. She had the brains and the beauty, he had the brawn, not to mention the talent for forgery. Together, they were unstoppable. Her first step was to scope out the area and to see who she recognized. Then, she would earn their trust, promise to help them escape, plan to meet them at a safe location where the Gestapo would be waiting to make their arrests. She'd slink in and out of bars and cafes, hang out at the back of opera houses, seeking out Jews in hiding who had emerged temporarily to let loose. Or she'd pretend she was hiding too, beg a man to buy her food, only to lead him straight to the Gestapo. She even lingered at the back of funerals of Germans who were suspected to have Jewish spouses. Stella was there waiting as the bereaved Jewish widow or widower left the grave with the Gestapo ready to swoop in and make their arrest. Once Stella turned someone in, she'd search their purse for an address book with names of more hidden Jews, perpetuating the cycle, leading the Gestapo to more arrests. Each Jew she turned in brought her 200 marks, nearly $1,500 today. But the real currency was the promise of her parents remaining alive. She hunted with a threat to their lives suspended above her head. For 7 months, Stella scoured bars, cafes, apartment buildings, hunting former classmates, neighbors, friends. For 7 months, she stood back and watched as the Gestapo dragged away the people she used to know. Every time, the Gestapo told her the same thing: comply, and her parents would live. The promise became her everything, her mantra, her core. She clung to it, because without it, what was she doing? What kind of person was she? She knew about her reputation among Jews. She knew they called her a monster, a traitor, that they claimed she could sniff out hidden Jews and defectors, that they circulated her picture as a warning. Each time she faltered, each time she thought she couldn't go on, she thought about her parents, about the SS officers trailing her constantly, watching her every move, about what they would do to her parents if she disobeyed in any way. Driven by the Gestapo's assurances, Stella turned in over 600 Jews. And then, one day, everything collapsed. Dobrike called her in. This time, his tone was different, cooler, detached. Her parents were on the next deportation list. He couldn't keep them in the transfer camp any longer. There was simply nothing he could do. The news hit her like a shot to the chest. She had gambled hundreds of lives, betrayed her community, stained her soul. And now, he was telling her it was all for nothing? Desperate, Stella pleaded with Dobrike to save her parents, remind him of all the Jews she had delivered into his hands. When that didn't work, she begged to be deported with them. Dobrike refused. He couldn't prevent her parents' deportation, but he was willing to bargain with her. He would arrange for them to be sent to Theresienstadt instead of Auschwitz. They would still serve as forced laborers, but at least they had a hope of surviving. There was just one condition, one line of fine print. If Stella wanted her parents to be sent to Theresienstadt, she would continue to turn in Jews in hiding. With nothing else to grasp onto, Stella agreed. She was in so deep, had sacrificed so much. She would do anything to save her parents. She refused to believe that she had turned Greifer for nothing. In February of 1944, Stella's parents were shoved onto a train to Theresienstadt, but the work camp was just a stop on their way to their final destination, Auschwitz. For months, she sent her parents postcards and bread, keeping up fragile hope. She worried for them, prayed they were safe. But by October of 1944, the responses had stopped coming. After nearly a year in Theresienstadt, Stella's parents had been shipped off to Auschwitz. Still, Dobrike continued to assure Stella that her parents were safe. She didn't believe him. But she also didn't stop hunting. Sometimes, she tried to help, because she was beginning to suspect that Dobrike was lying, that her parents had never received her postcards, her packages, that they were no longer in Theresienstadt, no longer on this earth at all. So even as she hunted, she did what she could to sabotage her own operation. She smuggled messages and forged papers, hid evidence from abandoned hideouts when she could slip it past the officers shadowing her. Nothing was clear anymore. Who was she but a tool in a machine she couldn't break? And what would happen when she was no longer a useful tool? In the fall of 1944, Stella and Rolf married, but the marriage was miserable. Both had affairs, and Stella got pregnant. The father was probably another Jewish snatcher, but she couldn't be sure. It didn't matter anyway. He disappeared, leaving her alone with the baby. Stella continued working for the Gestapo until March 1945. But as the Soviets advanced, she started to worry. What if they executed her for collaboration? What would happen to her little girl? Once again, she went into hiding. But this time, it wasn't the Germans she was worried about, it was the Allies. The Soviets found her in October 1945. By then, she was deeply depressed, nearing mania. And she deteriorated further when they took her daughter away. Stella tried to tell the Soviets that she was a victim, but when they brought her to the Jewish community office in Berlin to register for food rations, Jewish survivors recognized her. They formed a mob and started throwing punches. A Soviet official shielded her from the blows, but allowed the survivors to cut off her hair. She was broken, alone, humiliated. In June 1946, Stella was brought before a Soviet tribunal. The judges took minutes to proclaim her guilty and sentence her to 10 years of hard labor. Many of the Nazis who had directly orchestrated deportations and executed mass murders received far shorter sentences. But Stella rotted in prison for over a decade, because now, Stella was no longer simply a woman caught in a twisted trap. She was a symbol, a scapegoat for the world's shame and guilt. And still, it wasn't over. After 10 years in prison, Stella moved to West Berlin, where she was tried again in 1957. The press ran explosive headlines, playing on classic anti-Semitic tropes. Stella was morally deviant, deceitful to her core, a born criminal. The tabloids read, "Jewess sent all of her friends to the gas chamber." The court convicted her of aiding German crimes, sentencing her to another decade in jail. But since she had already served 10 years, she didn't serve again. This was a conviction on principle. It was easier to punish her than to look in the mirror. But by then, Stella herself was unable to look in the mirror. Her life had gone completely off the rails. Nothing had worked out the way it was supposed to. Her first husband had been taken from her, then her parents, then her reputation, then maybe her soul. And nothing she did seemed to help. Not the multiple marriages, not a conversion to Christianity, and a diagnosis of schizophrenia offered no relief. She had a label for an illness, but that label couldn't help her. By the time she jumped out of her apartment window, ending her life at 72 years old, Stella was already largely forgotten. Even her daughter didn't speak to her. If anyone remembered her at all, it was only for her crimes. There was no one left to remember the girl that had once been. The world knew her only through salacious films and tabloid exposés about this so-called monster. But few of these exposés wrestled with the circumstances that had shaped Stella's choices. It was easier to dismiss her as a monster than to explore the uncomfortable complexities of human nature. The Third Reich weaponized all of the things that made their victims human. Love, the desire to survive, even the close-knit nature of Jewish communities. They collapsed every moral boundary, every social norm, reducing people into instruments of their system. But that context was missing from the papers, the films, the exposés, the judgments. And that context matters, not because it necessarily absolves or redeems Stella, but because it reminds us that humans are complicated. And stories like Stella resist easy moral categories. It's simple and tempting to portray Stella as either an evil monster or a helpless victim without agency. But neither is entirely true. She did terrible things, and she was put in a terrible position. That uncomfortable complexity is what makes her story so important.